The hand of the Lord came upon me, and brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord, and set me down in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me all around them. There were very many lying in the valley, and they were very dry. He said to me, "Mortal, can these bones live?" I answered, "O Lord God, you know." Then he said to me, "Prophesy to these bones, and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God to these bones, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. I will lay sinews on you, and will cause flesh to come upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord." Ezekiel in the Valley Full of Bones is one of those passages that I have long wanted to turn into a narrative for this podcast. But there are some things that make that prospect challenging. Ezekiel seems to be recounting a vision, at least for the most part. The passage ends with a great multitude of resurrected people standing up in this valley. There's no sense in which we are supposed to take this multitude as something that actually came into existence. But the beginning of the story is less certain. Ezekiel speaks of being brought by the Spirit to the valley. Sometimes this is even translated as he was carried. Now, this is something that Ezekiel says happened to him a lot. He was constantly brought places by the Spirit. And sometimes he specifies that he was brought in a vision. But here he does not. So that makes you wonder, did he actually go to a valley? Was the valley real? Were the bones real? So I have some ideas about what actually happened and what Ezekiel might have experienced, and I would like to explore them in my usual narrative fashion. But before I get into the story, there is one thing that we're going to need to come to terms with. Biblical prophets are weird. I mean, maybe that goes without saying. They are, after all, people who say they receive messages from God. We would definitely not consider that normal in anyone today. So you kind of expect any prophet to be unusual. But Ezekiel is more than just unusual. He often seems to be quite detached from reality. Although he is supposed to be in Babylonia, his oracles are addressed to people and situations in Judah, hundreds of miles away. He isolates himself, doesn't speak, and often doesn't seem quite sure where he is. I know we should not diagnose people from a distance, but it just seems to me that he might have some mental health issues. Depression, dissociative disorder, post-traumatic stress, all seem like they might be good explanations for at least some of his behavior. And given what he and everyone else who had been carried off in the first exile before the Babylonians finally destroyed Jerusalem had gone through, I don't think it is a huge stretch to say that he might have been traumatized by what he had experienced. We don't know the real state of his mind, of course. We can never know. But I'm just saying that maybe we'd better not expect him to always behave or think rationally. So, with that in mind, shall we descend with Ezekiel down into a valley filled with bones? This is Retelling the Bible. Episode 9.9, The Man Who Prophesied to Bones. The word was spreading like wildfire among the exiles by the river Kibar. The thing that everyone dreaded, and the thing that Ezekiel himself had warned of, had finally happened. The siege of Jerusalem, begun by Nebuchadnezzar in the previous year, had finally come to a disastrous end. The people had become desperate and knew that they could not hold out much longer. And then the city wall had been breached, and the elite of the city decided that they would not wait until the enemy was ready to storm through the gap. So they took the whole army of the people and fled at night through the gate between the two walls near the king's garden. They managed to sneak through the Babylonian lines and fled toward the Arabah. But the Babylonian army pursued and finally overtook them on the plains near Jericho. There was the strength of the people, her bravest sons broken. They were scattered and slain in a great slaughter, while the elite were captured and taken into exile. Ezekiel was extremely distraught, much more than usual. Ever since the news had come to their settlement of the final destruction of Judah, he had been so upset. On one level, he should have been pleased. Had he not been the one to call this? Hadn't he warned the leaders again and again that their course would lead to destruction, extinction? This meant that he was right. Wasn't this the moment that every prophet relished? But how could Ezekiel feel good about any of it? Especially discouraging to him was the news that the elites, the very ones that Ezekiel blamed for everything that had gone wrong, had gotten away with it. The people they had abandoned in the city had simply been left in the clutches of the Babylonian army. And as for the brave young men of the militia, who chose none of this, many had been slaughtered in the valley of Jericho, their bones to lie unburied and far from their ancestors. And yet, the king and the elites had survived. Yes, they would be judged by the king of Babylon, but that would take months. All of this felt unjust to Ezekiel. It was just not right. And Ezekiel had always believed with all his heart that things had to be right. One day, in a desperate effort to clear his thoughts, Ezekiel went out of the settlement and into the Mesopotamian hills. Perhaps out there he could find some way to understand what it was that his God was doing. Ezekiel wandered for days. Not being a man who was very good at planning anything ahead, he had brought little to sustain himself. And so it was that after several days, his body was suffering from dehydration and hunger. He began to fall into a dissociative state, which was something that had happened to him before. The feeling was disorienting, to be sure, but he took some comfort from it. He knew that God had spoken to him before when he had been in such a state. When he stumbled into the valley, he really didn't know where he was. But his mind, desperately trying to make sense of what it was experiencing, began to think that it recognized certain landmarks and flooded him with a sense of familiarity, making him feel as if he were miraculously back home in Judah, as ridiculous as that might seem. As he looked around him, he noted with great curiosity that there was something unusual about the place. There were these strange white rocks littered all over the floor of the valley. He had never seen anything quite like them before. He drew closer and, in an effort to understand, he bent and picked up one of the rocks. He was horrified when he realized what he was holding. This was no rock. It was bone. Bone that had been bleached white by the sun over the years. And Ezekiel, an experienced priest, who had carried out many sacrifices over the years, had seen enough animal bones in his life to realize that this was not one of them. He was holding in his hand a human thigh bone. He dropped the bone in shock and spun around, hoping that he was wrong. But everywhere he looked, he saw the same thing. None of the white rocks were rocks. He was in a valley full of bones. And suddenly, Ezekiel knew exactly where he was. Somehow, by the Spirit, he had been brought out and laid down in the valley of Jericho. This was the place where all of the men of Judah had died, their bodies left to be gnawed by the animals and bleached by the sun, until all that was left was dead dry bones. Mesopotamia is the cradle of civilization. For an incredibly long time, people have been building cities and structures of power in that corner of the world. And that meant that for centuries, armies had faced off one against another between the two rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates. So many battles had been fought that none knew the names of all of them, or who had fallen. And so it really was not all that hard, while out wandering in the hills, to come across an ancient battlefield where men had fought and died. That Ezekiel should have stumbled upon one such place would hardly be surprising. And given the terrible news he had heard of the slaughter that had taken place near Jericho, how could his mind not have turned to the bodies of the dead who had been left to rot there? In his addled mind, it only seemed obvious that he was in that very valley, and that the bones were the men of Judah who had died. And if he had come here, it could only be because God's Spirit had brought him. And if the Spirit had brought him, surely it was because God had something to show him here. As Ezekiel walked about in that valley full of bones, a valley that he was convinced was in Judah, where he implausibly found himself, there was one question that repeated again and again in his mind. Can these bones live? It was not a hypothetical question. In his mind, at least, these were no ordinary bones. They represented the last strength of an entire nation. And if their lives had been squandered in the last-ditch effort that the elites made to escape, the only question that had plagued Ezekiel ever since he had heard was, could they live? Could the nation possibly rise again from such a horrible end? That was the real question that weighed Ezekiel down as he wandered that valley, appalled at every scrap of whiteness that he saw. And it was a question to which the only reasonable answer was no. There was no way that they could possibly live again. But Ezekiel couldn't bring himself to say that. And so instead, he answered the question that he knew had come from God, saying, "You know, Yahweh Elohim, only you know if they can live again." And that was when he felt a familiar stirring within him. It was the call of a prophet. God was giving him an oracle to speak, and he had learned from harsh experience that he dare not suppress that impulse. It was puzzling this time, though, for a prophet is supposed to have an audience. Prophecies had to be targeted at the audience, and the only audience he could see was dead. "Oh well," he said to himself, "I suppose that these bones couldn't be any less responsive than the people I usually prophesy to." So he decided to go for it. "O dry bones, hear the word of Yahweh," he intoned. "Thus says Yahweh Elohim to these bones, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. I will lay sinews on you, and will cause flesh to come upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am Yahweh." If you had been there in that Mesopotamian valley on that day, standing beside our prophet, I'm not exactly sure what you might have seen, but I can almost guarantee that you would not have seen what Ezekiel saw. Even he seems to understand that when those bones rose up and came together with a great rattling, when the hip bone connected to the thigh bone, and the thigh bone connected to the knee bone, and, well, you know how that goes. It all happened inside of his poor, distressed, and dissociative mind. He became detached from reality, and he saw a vision. But just because it was a vision doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't true, or at least that it didn't point to a deep truth. So, if you had been there in that valley, all you might have seen was a troubled man standing there and staring into space. I don't know what you would have seen, but I can tell you what Ezekiel saw, because he reported it afterwards as an oracle. He declared that God had brought him to that valley, and that before his eyes, those dead and dry bones came together to form a mighty host. And when the prophet prophesied to the wind blew into them, and they became living beings, the dead raised to new life. He saw it, even if you wouldn't have, and he knew that it was the truth, and that it changed everything. What Ezekiel saw in that valley was very personal. He had predicted terrible things, and many of those terrible things had come to pass. How could he not have been troubled? He may have even been feeling some guilt. Had he caused all of this with his words? It would not be surprising for someone who was relatively mentally stable to react to such a thing with situational depression and even dissociation. And Ezekiel does not seem to have been particularly stable. But the message behind this story is that Ezekiel's troubled mind was able to find hope for the future in a very dismal time. Even though the nation as he had known it was as good as dead, did he not have a God who was capable of taking even dead, dry bones, putting them back together, and breathing new life into them? Ezekiel's vision, or hallucination, or whatever you want to call it, may have been very personal. But once it had become part of the book that bore his name, it took on a life of its own. As I explored in my previous episode, 6.2, 7 Tortures for 7 Brothers, in the intense persecution that led to the Maccabean revolt over 400 years later, the vibrant vision that Ezekiel had left as a legacy became the germ of an understanding of how God would also raise up the righteous dead who had remained faithful in hard times. This contributed to the idea of the resurrection of the dead that became so central to the Christian faith. Isn't it interesting to trace all of that back to the day when a very troubled man had a vision of God's power in a valley filled with bones? That is it for this episode of Retelling the Bible. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe so you can get all future episodes. The theme music for the podcast is Ada. The mood music for this episode was The Escalation. The music is by Kevin MacLeod, licensed in the Creative Commons, and can be found at incompetech.com. You can contact me on Blue Sky at Retelling the Bible, and on the Facebook page Retelling the Bible. Show notes for this episode have been posted at retellingthebible.wordpress.com. Thanks as always to my Patreon supporters, and a special thanks to Amma, who suggested that it was high time I did this story. I know it might not have gone exactly as you imagined it, Amma, but I appreciate the nudge. This is Retelling the Bible, and I have been your storyteller, W. Scott McCandless.